Hello, everyone. This is Sean from the Soccernostalgia blog. I have the pleasure to interview Irish freelance writer, historian, and broadcaster Mr. John O'Carroll. Mr. O'Carroll has appeared multiple times on the podcast discussing the history of the Republic of Ireland national team. This interview is separate from a podcast series. This video interview will serve as a companion piece to a written blog presentation on the historic World Cup qualifiers on November 17, 1993. Hello, John. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, hello, Shahan. Always a pleasure, as always, to be talking on your podcast.
Can you paint a picture of the significance of this day, November 17, 1993, and what was at stake?
Yes, indeed. Well, 17th November 1993, in the European zone, namely UEFA, it was what transpired to be the final night of the old World Cup qualifying system. Now, as you know, since qualifying for 1998, when the group stages of the qualification campaigns have concluded, some teams, then particularly second place teams, go into a series of playoffs. But this playoff system, although it has been in place since the qualifying for 1998, prior to 1998, there was no playoff system in place. What you had was you had your groups, maybe 6 or 7 qualifying groups, and the top two in each would qualify. So, as I say, 17th November 1993, it was the final night of qualifying in the UEFA Confederation. And there were no playoffs, so everything had to be decided on the night. And as we will see, there were 6 qualifying groups, and in 5 of the groups, qualifying places were still up for grabs. In most groups, you had 1 qualifying place up for grabs, but in one group, you had 2. And it was the top 2 in each group qualified because for the 1994 World Cup qualifying in Europe, you had 6 qualifying groups because Europe had been allocated 12 qualifying places plus the holders at the time, which were Germany. So UEFA anyway decided for the qualifying to split the teams into 6 qualifying groups with the top 2 in each group qualifying for USA 94. Now, what all that meant, Shahan, was that, as I say, you had 6 groups. 5 of the groups had 6 teams, and one of the groups had 7. One of the groups had 7 teams. Now, one of the 16 groups subsequently ended up becoming a 5-team group because Yugoslavia, even though they had been included in the qualifying draw for the World Cup, they were subsequently excluded because of the wars that were going on in Yugoslavia and the subsequent breakup of that nation. So they had to withdraw. So their group, which was Group 5, became a 5-team group. And in actual fact, Shahan, that was the only group of the 6 that had been decided before this night, the 17th November, in that Russia and Greece had both qualified. So that group was done and dusted. But as I say, in the other 5 groups, there was, qualifying places in each of them to play for. And what added to the intrigue as well was that in most of the groups that qualification was up for grabs, you had 3 teams, competing for 2 places. And the way the fixtures were in each of the groups, you had 2 of the 3 competing teams meeting each other on the final qualifying night. So all that added to the intrigue and the excitement. And we should remember as well that, of course, this was 1993, and satellite television and red buttons and all of this did not exist at the time. Well, satellite television, I should say, was in its infancy, and red button TV where you could watch maybe 6 or 7 channels simultaneously didn't exist. So almost all the matches kicked off at the one time, but there was no way of following the matches from around Europe because, for instance, here in Ireland, of course, we would have been tuned into the qualifying match between the Republic and Northern Ireland. We would have seen a little bit of the England-San Marino game because the Ireland-Northern Ireland match kicked off at 8 o'clock our time, whereas the England-San Marino game kicked off at 7. So we would have seen maybe the first half of that game before looking at the Ireland game. But the other matches in the other groups, as I say, we did not have the benefit of multi-channel TV, so we had no idea how the matches in the other groups were going until later that night when the Eurosport TV channel had a highlights program. I think that program ran from 10 o'clock until 12 o'clock midnight our time. So it was only when that program was broadcast that we saw what had gone on in the other groups, because almost all the matches were kicking off at the same time. So, with the absence of a red button like we have nowadays, it was next to impossible to keep track of all the matches. And it was only when the final whistle went in the very last of those matches to finish did we know for sure who was going to USA 94. So, for excitement and drama and suspense, I don't think that night will be equal. Certainly, with the modern playoff system that we have now. Because, it was a night that it made heroes of some players, made villains of others, managerial casualties resulted. A feud, as we'll see later in the podcast, a feud started that night between a player and a manager that almost 20 years later culminated in a lawsuit. So we will come to that. And of course, no matter, the drama and the excitement of that night was one thing, but everything was put into perspective because following one of the qualifying matches, a spectator unfortunately lost his life. So, that put everything into perspective. But as I say, for drama and excitement, I don't think this night will ever be equaled or paralleled again.
And with all the excitement, I think most people forgot that Brazil and Germany actually played a friendly on that day.
Yes. And then, yes. And then later that night, Shahan, it was at midnight our time. Argentina were playing Australia in the second leg of their intercontinental playoff in Buenos Aires. And that game was actually broadcast live on German TV, which was available in Ireland at the time through the Astra satellite. So, there was plenty of excitement that night anyway, and plenty of qualifying places up for grabs.
So let's go through group by group and present the status of each group in this final day. So on group one, we have Italy, Switzerland, Portugal, Scotland, Malta, and Estonia. Scotland, Malta, and Estonia were already out. So it was like a three-way fight between Italy, Switzerland, and Portugal. So going into this last day, Italy were on top with 14 points. A series of late wins had given Portugal also 14 points, and Switzerland was third with 13 points. However, Switzerland were on the driver's seat because they had to play Estonia, and that match was a formality. Everyone knew Switzerland was going to win. So Switzerland's place was more or less settled. So it was a battle between Italy and Portugal, and they were playing each other on that day at Milan. Malta and Scotland, obviously, it was a inconsequential match, but I believe that was like Craig Brown's second match in charge, so it was an experimental match for Scotland anyway.
Yes, indeed, Shahan. Well, you have summed up the state of play perfectly. Of course, in those days, it was 2 points for a win, but Switzerland, as you mentioned, they started the group in third place, but if they beat Estonia by 2 goals or more, they were going to qualify. And as you say, that was going to be a formality because Switzerland were playing that game at home. And as it turned out, Switzerland cruised to a 4-0 win. Roy Hodgson, the well-known manager, he was managing Switzerland at the time. That put Switzerland through.
Let's remember, John, that this was Switzerland's first World Cup qualification since 1966. So it was an epic event in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did get to see a couple of Switzerland's games in this group. And they were doing well because in their 2 matches against Italy, they got a win and a draw against them, which was good going. Now, they lost to Portugal, but they were motoring along nicely. And the signs were there that Switzerland could be potentially an up-and-coming force to be reckoned with in the future. But anyway, Switzerland, as it turned out, beat Estonia 4-0, so that put them through. But I suppose the real drama was in the Italy-Portugal game, which, as you said, was happening in Milan. Now, The teams, as you mentioned, they were level on points, but they were also level on goal difference. But Italy had the advantage in that they had scored more goals. And in actual fact, the margins were so tight that the previous month, Portugal had played Estonia in Portugal, and Portugal won that game 3-0. But if Portugal had scored a fourth goal that night, Portugal would have gone into this game against Italy requiring just a draw. So that's how tight the margins were. Now, as you say, Portugal started off this campaign sort of poorly because they played Italy in Lisbon early in the campaign and they lost 3-1. But they had a particularly notable 5-0 victory over Scotland in April of 1993. And that combined with Italy's somewhat dithering form a little bit, kind of put Portugal back into the mix as regards qualification. So basically, anyway, this game between Italy and Portugal was going to be more or less a qualifying decider. So Portugal, of course, they were managed by Carlos Queiroz, who came to prominence in later years. And of course, they were backboned by the team that had won the World Cup in 1991. Players such as Paulo Sousa, Rui Costa, who was an up-and-coming player at the time, and Paulo Futre. Now, I'm not sure whether Luis Figo was involved this time or not. Maybe
He didn't play in this match. He was
oh,
not
did you?
involved. Yeah.
Oh, yes, yes, okay. But anyway, they had a number of good individual players, and they played actually what's known today as tiki-taka football, which we hear so much about. But Portugal were very much, I suppose, maybe in those days, they were the exponents of that game, type of game, or possession football as it was known back then. So in the first half, anyway, by all accounts, now again, we're only going on recollections of television highlights that I would have seen after the game. Portugal largely dominated the first half, but Italy, who were actually backboned by their defence, which more or less was an entire AC Milan defence. And of course, the match played in Milan as well, which was really a home game for them in more ways than one. The Italian defence was good, and Pagliuca, the Italian goalkeeper, was never really tested. Now, in the second half, kind of the game balanced out a bit in that Italy came more into the game, and it was really an even enough game because they introduced Demetrio Albertini as a substitute, and then shortly afterwards they introduced Roberto Mancini. But with 7 minutes to go anyway, the game was still deadlocked at 0-0, and a Portugal goal at that stage would have knocked the Italians out. However, with 7 minutes to go, Dino Baggio scored a goal which today would not have been given because he was, noticeably offside. But for some reason, the goal was allowed stand. Italy went in front, and that was the way the match resulted.
I uploaded the highlights on YouTube, and on the commentary, the commentator says it's touch and go offside.
Yes.
So, yeah. In fact, this was the match that I watched. I remember I was in university at the time. After my classes, I came home, and this was the match that was shown. This was the one that I was watching, on television.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
yeah.
And I recall as well, Shahan, that Eurosport TV highlights program that went out later that night here in Europe, that was the first of the highlights they showed. So that was the game they kind of, Eurosport particularly featured. So we did get to see, kind of extended highlights of that game. But the game anyway finished 1-0 to Italy, so that put Italy through. And of course, in injury time, Fernando Couto actually ended up receiving a red card. So that was Italy through and Portugal out. But I mean, Portugal, anybody that saw him at the time, they could see that there was the potential for a fine team in him. And I mean, that fine team did come to fruition in the years that followed.
Yeah, they were on the verge of becoming the golden
Yes, that's right.
generation of Portugal.
That's right. Yeah,
That
yeah. I think actually this World Cup qualifying campaign might have come a little bit too soon for him.
Yes,
But
yes,
from the qualifying for Euro 96 and so on, they did become a potent outfit. And they've
yes.
remained so more or less ever since.
Italy won the group with 16 points. Switzerland second with 15 points.
As it turned out, Switzerland, they did disappoint me a little at USA 94. Because I thought with their qualifying record that they would have maybe progressed a bit further in that World Cup.
Yeah. I think in an interview, the late Franz Beckenbauer, who just passed away a few days ago, I remember, I think it was in World Soccer. He said something like teams like Switzerland will find out that qualifying is one thing, participating in a World
Mm.
Cup is a different matter.
Yes, and you could even say the same, Shahan, for the group for Norway, which will
Indeed,
feature
I was
now.
thinking
Yeah.
about that myself. Yeah, just
Mm.
now. Yeah. Now we come to Group Two with
Yes.
England, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Turkey, and San Marino. Against all odds, Norway had already won this group, and they didn't even play in this last round of matches. So this is the Norway of Egil Olsen and all those players who would grace the English Premier League into the next decade. It was really a fight between Netherlands and England for the final spot. And we all know this is Graham Taylor's England, and they had disappointed so much during this qualification phase. And it culminated in the previous month when the Netherlands won 2-0. And we all remember, the whole Graham Taylor, do I not like that? The whole
Yes.
TV documentary, the foul by Koeman where he should have been sent off on Platt, that he would have had VAR existed, and then scoring a couple of minutes later on a
Yeah.
beautiful free kick.
Mm.
So we all know that. So at
Mm.
this point, the odds were against England, even though they still had a mathematical chance to qualify. So
Yes.
Netherlands had 15 points, England had 13 points, but they had to hope that the Netherlands would lose against Poland, and I think they had to win by like a 7 or 8 goal margin or
Yes.
something like that. Yeah. So,
Mm.
like I said, the odds were against them, but they nevertheless had a minimal hope to advance. And of course, they're playing San Marino at Bologna, and
Mm.
they were expecting to score an avalanche of goals. However, I don't think anybody expected that they would be behind after 8 seconds. So,
Indeed. Yeah, and of course, as a side note as well, Shahan, you had two World Cup qualification matches taking place that night in Italy, because as well as the Italy Portugal game in Milan, you also had this England San Marino game taking place in Bologna. And the reason it took place in Bologna was San Marino, I believe, were playing their home matches for this campaign in Bologna because their own ground in San Marino wasn't up to international standards. This match actually kicked off an hour earlier than most of the matches in Europe. So we were able to see in Ireland, virtually all of the first half of this game. But yes, I mean, it will be forever remembered for, San Marino taking the lead after just 8 seconds, because prior to this, San Marino had been in international football for a couple of seasons at this stage, and they'd only scored two international goals. Yet in this match, they scored almost straight from the kickoff. Thanks to an unusual and uncharacteristic mistake from Stuart Pearce, where he attempted to play a back pass that for some reason fell short. And David Gualtieri of San Marino nipped in and put the ball past David Seaman. So that moment, those 8 seconds, San Marino taking the lead, that really has, in many ways, in the popular mind, come to sum up the entire Graham Taylor era in charge of England. Of being kind of, I suppose, maybe for want of a better term, or if you want to be crude about it, maybe slapstick and amateurish and so on. The fact that San Marino, a team of part timers, and to all intents and purposes, they were the whipping boys in this group. They were still able to score after just 8 seconds against England.
England predictably won this match 7-1. Poland scored twice, Ian Wright scored 4 goals, and Les Ferdinand scored one.
In this game, England were behind for about 20 minutes. I mean, I think it was more or less 20 minutes into the game before England managed to draw a level.
Yes, 22nd minute when Poland
Oh,
scored. Yeah.
yes, that's right. Because David Gualtieri actually said in an interview after the game, he said, you should have heard the language they were using to each other, because they were, by the time they'd equalised, they were coming to get a little bit frustrated. But obviously, once they equalised, then the floodgates subsequently opened, and that was really that.
Well, in the other match at Poznan, the Netherlands won 3-1. Dennis Bergkamp scored twice. Ronald de Boer scored another one just before the end. And Netherlands with Dick Advocaat as manager were through.
Yes,
Now,
indeed.
do you remember the whole condition of Dick Advocate's management for this qualifiers? He was supposed to only manage during the qualifiers, and then Johan Cruyff was supposed to take over for the World Cup finals. But after this, I guess there was some disagreement between Johan Cruyff and the federation, and eventually Dick Advocat was confirmed to be the full-time manager for the World Cup. But at this point, for all intents and purposes, his task was done, and Johan Cruyff was supposed to take over.
And I think actually Dick Advocat, did he subsequently drop Ruud Gullit for the World Cup?
Well, he
Or he
selected Ruud
did?
Gullit, but Ruud Gullit, just before the departure, he due to training camp, he quit the national team, and he did not disclose his reasons at the time. I don't know if you remember, there was a press conference with Dick Advocat speaking. Ruud Gullit just had his head down and didn't speak the entire time.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's
Mm.
a whole drama in itself.
Yes, indeed. But going back to this qualification, of course, as you say, Holland, they did win in Poland. And actually, Poland too had started this World Cup qualification campaign quite well. But for some reason, kind of in the second half of the campaign, Poland just bottomed out. I mean, Holland won 3-1. And of course, Dennis Bergkamp, who was making his mark at that stage with Inter Milan, I think he may have scored 2 goals. He certainly scored one
Yes.
anyway. And he may have scored two. And of course, the Dutch too, they made a mark at USA 94. They went all the way to the quarterfinals and lost a memorable game to Brazil.
We come to yet another dramatic group. Group 3. We have Spain, Republic of Ireland, Denmark, Northern Ireland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Albania.
This group, Shahan, was kind of widely acknowledged as being the epicenter of all the drama and suspense.
Yes.
And yes.
Going into this final day, Denmark were on top with 18 points. Spain and Republic of Ireland had 17 points. Everything was at stake in this final day of matches, and any combination, two of these three teams could have qualified depending on the results. At Belfast, we have the politically charged All Ireland clash between Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland. And at Sevilla, Spain is taking on Denmark. Go.
Okay. Okay. Where do I begin?
Exactly. Yeah.
I can begin anywhere in this group. But anyway, I'll start first anyway with the Ireland or the Ireland Northern Ireland game in Belfast. Now, as you mentioned, you see, at this time, okay, it was always going to be a derby game, and a result was going to be hard earned in Belfast. But what exacerbated the climate in the lead up to this game was there was a lot of political tension. And a few weeks previously, a terrorist atrocity had been committed in Belfast by the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. So that actually only inflamed the tension coming up to this game even further. And also, as well, the previous March, Northern Ireland had come to Dublin to play the Republic in the reverse qualification fixture. And the Republic had something of an easy 3-0 victory. In actual fact, there were 3 goals up by half time. So the game actually was so easy for the Republic that a section of the support in Dublin that day started chanting that there was only one team in Ireland. And of course, this would have, resonated, or it would have reverberated and I suppose stuck in the craw of a lot of the Northern Ireland players who were in action that day, and indeed their manager, Billy Bingham. So this
Who,
too would.
let's remind everyone, this was his final match as Northern Ireland manager.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So he was keen. I mean, political tensions aside, and kind of the World Cup qualification at stake, he was going to be keen to finish his managerial tenure on a high anyway. So all that anyway fed into what Rob Smythe, who is an English journalist and writes a column for the Guardian newspaper, he described it well as he described it as a maelstrom of hate. Because in the days leading up to the game, there was actually talk of moving the game from Belfast because tensions were so high at the time. And even, I think, Old Trafford was mentioned as a possible venue, and indeed I think maybe Anfield or Goodison Park were suggested as well. But for a finish anyway, UEFA actually decided that the game could go ahead in Belfast. However, instead of making the trip from Dublin to Belfast by road, the Republic actually had to go by plane for security reasons. When the Republic's team arrived at Windsor Park for the final training session before the game, they were met by a number of maybe children, maybe 10 and 11-year-olds, and all the children anyway were making obscene hand gestures and, shouting insults of all kinds at the Republic's players. And on the night itself, then, actually, there was arena barbed wire evident as they entered the ground. So Alan McLaughlin, who actually played that night and, was the scored equalising goal, he actually said afterwards that actually the safest place to be that night was on the pitch, because the Republic had virtually, or officially anyway, they had no supporters present, again, because of the volatile atmosphere. And of course, the fact then that several of the Republic's players had been born outside of Ireland, and
We have to
that
mention that some of the tension was brought on by Billy Bingham himself,
yeah,
who
yes,
openly declared that he would want to block Republic Ireland's path to the World Cup. And he called some of the Republic Ireland players, most particularly Alan Kernahan, if I'm not mistaken, as
yeah,
mercenaries, because
mm,
I think potentially there were Northern Ireland selectable players, the likes of Kernahan, but they chose
yes.
to play for Republic.
And I think actually Alan Kernahan played schoolboy for Northern Ireland. So that would have contributed as well to the ill feeling as well, that maybe Alan Kernahan for one was seen as somebody that sort of jumped ship,
Right.
from a less successful team at the time to a successful team. And that Windsor Park was quite a small stadium at the time, so the atmosphere was quite claustrophobic. The game anyway kicked off. As I say, it was kicking off the same, simultaneously with the Spain-Denmark game. The first half anyway of the Ireland-Northern Ireland game was really a nondescript affair. It was really, I suppose, in one ways, maybe a typical sort of English league game. And of course, the tension of the occasion and the fact that there was so much at stake, certainly for the Republic anyway, meant that, the game was never going to be a classic. It was in many ways going to be, I suppose, maybe a dour, maybe run of the mill type spectacle as regards, the quality of football and so on. But in the second half, of course, the game was still, I suppose, moving along. And then, with about 20 minutes to go, out of nothing, Jimmy Quinn scored what I have to say was a stunning folly to give Northern Ireland the lead in that game. So at that stage, anyway, the Republic were going out of the World Cup. And when Northern Ireland went ahead, anyway, Jack Charlton decided to make a substitution, and he'd intended Tony Cascarino to go on. So on the sideline, he gave Tony Cascarino the nod to get ready. But Tony Cascarino, for some reason, had forgotten to put on his kit. So all Tony had on basically was a tracksuit and a t-shirt under it. So Tony anyway realised that he didn't have on his kit. So he said to Jack, he said, I've actually forgotten to put on my kit. I'm going to have to go back into the dressing room. And Jack Charlton actually let, an unrepeatable expletive at him. But anyway, what I should point out as well was that, and this actually, we'll discuss it actually, it culminated in an incident between Jack and Billy Bingham after the game. When Jimmy Quinn scored the goal, put Northern Ireland in front, a member of the Northern Ireland backroom staff, which it subsequently emerged actually was Jimmy Nicholl, who was Billy Bingham's assistant manager, he made a particular hand gesture towards the Republic's bench, and he shouted, "Up yours," to Maurice Setters, who was Jack Charlton's assistant. So anyway, Jack Charlton actually, when he was made aware of it, he mistakenly thought that the message had come from Billy Bingham himself. So anyway, getting back to the game, by the time Tony Cascarino had put on his kit, the Republic had equalised when another substitute, Alan McLaughlin, got on the end of a free kick, chested the ball down and scored a fine volley into the left-hand corner from just out from about the edge of the penalty area. So it was a fine goal. It drew the Republic level, and ultimately that was the goal that was to put the Republic through, because which we'll come to know in a couple of moments, if the Spain-Denmark game had gone another way, even a draw would have eliminated the Republic. But as we'll see now when we discuss the Spain-Denmark game and, the consequence of that game, a draw was subsequently enough to put the Republic through. So the game anyway finished 1-1. Now, in the aftermath of the game, actually, when the game had finished, the Republic's players celebrated because they thought the game in Seville was all over, although the game in Seville was still in progress. But there was another couple of minutes to play in it. But a couple of minutes later, anyway, the final whistle sounded in Seville, and as it turned out, the Republic were through. But in the aftermath of the game, anyway, Jack Charlton was still a bit peeved over, what had gone on the sideline when Northern Ireland had gone in front. So he said anyway afterwards in his autobiography, he said, I saw Billy Bingham talking to the press, and I went over to him to congratulate him, on his retirement and, on a good game. But for some reason, Jack Charlton said, I ended up actually pointing a finger at Billy and saying to him, up yours too. So Billy Bingham anyway, had no idea what had transpired. As I say, it only became evident after the game what had happened. And the absurdity of the whole night was summed up about an hour after the final whistle went, in that Billy Bingham, as you said, was stepping down as Northern Ireland manager, and in a social club, which was situated quite near Windsor Park, or it could have been in Windsor Park itself, Jack Charlton, a presentation was being made to Billy Bingham, and Jack Charlton was asked to make the presentation. So Jack, anyway, went into this crowded room, to make the presentation. And a lot of the people in the room had been in the crowd or in the stands, and they would have been there abusing Jack and the Republic players, throughout the duration of the entire match. But as Jack said, and he could never understand it, when he went into the room, he was greeted with a standing ovation and thunderous applause. So even though, there was hostility on the pitch and for the duration of the match, when the game was over, the Northern Ireland people and indeed the players and backroom staff were all genuinely delighted that the Republic had qualified. Because Alan MacDonald, who was the Northern Ireland captain, he came into the Republic's dressing room after the game, to congratulate him and wish him all the best at the World Cup. Yeah, and indeed, and just as a footnote, Shahan, exactly 12 months later, the Republic went back to Belfast to play Northern Ireland in a qualifying match for Euro 96. And even though, naturally enough, the atmosphere would have been part of Northern Ireland, there was nothing like the hostility that was there in 1993. In actual fact, just before I go away from this game, there's a well-known soccer historian and archivist actually here in Ireland. He's actually a native of Limerick. Gary Spain is his name. And he actually was in the crowd in Windsor Park that night. He was actually one of the few, if any, supporters the Republic had. And he said anyway that for the entire duration of the game, he had to remain completely quiet, even when the Republic scored, because the people around him did not know he was from the Republic. Right. So, yeah, so that was that. But anyway, that was only part. The Republic Northern Ireland game was only part of the drama in this group, because as we'll see, events in the Ireland game were going to be intertwined with events in this game that took place in Seville between Spain and Denmark.
In this match, in the 10th minute, the Spain goalkeeper and captain, Andoni Zubizarreta, he accidentally threw the ball to his Barcelona clubmate, Michael Laudrup, and he was forced to foul him, and as the last man, he was sent off. So as early as the 10 minutes, Spain have to send in their substitute goalkeeper. Now, with one less man, Spain actually won this match when in the 63rd minute, Fernando Hierro headed in Goycochea's corner kick. Spain won this match, and this was, by the way, Denmark's one and only loss during the qualifiers.
Yeah, and only the second goal they conceded.
Yes. The difference between these teams was so razor thin that any of these three teams could have qualified on merit, but one had to be eliminated, unfortunately.
Yes, one had to be eliminated, was right. And then, of course, there was controversy to this day over the Spanish goal. In that, was there a foul on Peter Schmeichel in the build up to that goal? It seems as though there actually was. But it was a strange game because, as I say, we did not see the game in Ireland. We only have seen brief highlights on Eurosport's television channel afterwards. But when the Republic's game with Northern Ireland was in progress, the Irish television channel here, RTE, every 5 minutes they were flashing up on the screen, the score from Seville between Spain and Denmark. So we knew what was, even though we didn't have the pictures, we knew what was going on in Seville. But yeah, it was a strange sight of game because, I mean, Denmark, as you said, they went into this final round of fixtures unbeaten, only having conceded one goal in 11 qualifying matches. After 10 minutes of this game against Spain, as you say, Spain were reduced to 10 players. So, I mean, all the initiative was with Denmark. But it seems as well that Spain and the Spanish football team seem to have some psychological hold over the Danes.
Yes.
In that, Spain had beaten Denmark, kind of maybe a little bit unexpectedly in the semi-final of Euro 84. In Mexico 86, then, Spain and Denmark met each other in the knockout round. Denmark was strongly fancied, but Spain actually ended up winning that game 5-1, which was, well, I won't say it was a sensation, but it was certainly a shock. Emilio Butragueño scored 4 goals in that game. And then in Euro 88, Spain played Denmark again in the group stages of that game, and Spain won that game as well 3-2. So it seemed as though Spain was something of a bogey team for Denmark. Maybe because of that, even though Denmark had the extra man for most of the game, maybe Denmark was still kind of subconsciously cautious in that maybe they feared that Spain were going to pull a rabbit from the hat again somehow. In that Spain was something of a banana skin for Denmark at this time, no matter how well Denmark were going or no matter how poorly Spain were going. For some reason, Spain always seemed to do well against Denmark. So I think because of that, instead maybe of Denmark taking the initiative and really pressing on, they became cautious and maybe they believed as well at this stage that a draw would have been good enough for them, which as it turned out, it would have been because Denmark were leading this group going into this final round of matches. So a draw actually would have put Denmark through. So maybe that whole thing, and then the fact as well that Seville was always a raucous atmosphere and it was very partisan Spain. And it always was an intimidating place for visiting teams to go over the years. Maybe that too fed into the Danish subconsciousness and that, maybe they kind of took a sort of a safety first approach and kind of were going to play it safe. Maybe if they could nick a goal, maybe on a counter attack, so much the better. But as it turned out, a draw would have been enough for the Danes. So maybe a combination of all that fed into the Danish subconsciousness. But at any rate, anyway, even though they had the extra man, they did not really kick on from it. You have to feel sorry for Denmark because they played 12 qualified matches, only conceded 2 goals, only lost 1 game. This was the only game they lost. And yet, they only finished third in the group and were eliminated. And the irony was, how they finished third was that, when all was said and done, Spain won the group on 19 points. The Republic and Denmark were level on 18 points. They were also level on goal difference. However, the Republic, who were well known as a team that they had difficulty in scoring goals, actually ended up finishing ahead of Denmark on goals scored. They had scored more goals than the Danes. So it was that alone that took the Republic through and put Denmark out. What I would say was that even though Denmark had lost only 1 game in all of this qualification and they'd only conceded 2 goals, they had made something of a slow start to qualifying because in the early days of the 1992-93 season, at the very start of qualification, Denmark, maybe they were suffering a little bit of a hangover from winning Euro 92 and that they played Latvia and Lithuania and only drew both those games. So ultimately, they were the results that were to cost Denmark in the long run. Now, we have to point out as well, before we finish this, up to with 2 games to go in this qualification, which would have been, the previous month in October, Spain were really in bother because it was looking at that stage up to the second last round of matches that Denmark and the Republic were going to go through and that the Republic were actually going to win the group. But Spain, anyway, basically, Spain had to win their last two qualification games against the Republic in Dublin and this game in Seville against Denmark. And Spain managed to do that. So, I mean, we have to give credit to Spain as well, you know, from rescuing what was a near impossible situation. And one other significant thing was that the previous month in October, when Spain beat the Republic of Ireland in Dublin, Spain won that game 3-1. They were actually 3-0 up inside the first 25 minutes. But with 12 minutes to go, John Sheridan scored a consolation goal for the Republic. And even though it was only a consolation goal on the day, at the end of the group, when all was said and done, this was ultimately a goal that went a long way towards taking the Republic to America. Because if the Republic hadn't got that consolation goal on that occasion, Denmark would have finished ahead of the Republic on goal difference.
Like I said, very, very close margins.
Very tight. And even at the finish, it was still very tight. I mean, only goals scored separated the Republic from Denmark. So really, between the Republic, Denmark, and Spain, there was only a kick of a ball between all three teams.
Indeed. Yeah.
You know? And of course, Northern Ireland too, even though they were unpredictable, they were always going to be a potential banana skin for anyone as well.
Now we come to Group 4. We have Romania, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, who would break up at the end of 1992 and become the Republic of Czechs and Slovaks for the remainder of the qualifiers, Wales, Cyprus, and Faroe Islands. Now, going into the last day of matches, any of the four teams between Belgium, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and even Wales had an outside chance of qualifying. Belgium were first with 14 points. Romania were second with 13 points. Republic of Czechs and Slovaks and Wales had 12 points. Now, on this last day, Belgium were playing the Republic of Czechs and Slovaks at Brussels, and Wales were hosting Romania. And with a win, Wales could have leapfrogged over Romania and hope for even a draw in a match against Belgium would have helped Wales. It wasn't a guarantee that with a win they would have qualified, but it certainly would have looked likely that a win would send them through.
Yes, indeed. Now, this was a group that, you know, kind of both qualification or both qualifying places, I should say, were up for grabs. And you had a four-way battle for them. But to put simply, Belgium and Romania both needed only a draw. Whereas Wales and the Czechs, or the RCS as they were then, both needed to win. Now, Wales would have had to win by 2 goals if the RCS had defeated Belgium. But as it turned out, the game between the RCS and Belgium ended in a draw. So that meant that any sort of a win would have done Wales.
However, Romania took the lead in the first half through George Hagi's long-range shot. But Wales battled back, and in the 61st minute, Dean Saunders tied the match. A few minutes later, Wales had the opportunity to score the go-ahead goal with a penalty kick. But the normally reliable Paul Bodin missed his kick. Afterwards, just before the end, Florin Raducioiu scored Romania's winner. Wales were out. Coming so close, but they were out. This was the closest Wales had gotten, I would say, maybe since last qualifying in 1950. Yeah, they had not qualified since 1958 at this point. Let's remember. And I think this was the closest they may have gotten since, if I remember correctly.
Yes, and they were not to come close for qualifying for another 20 years.
Yes.
You know, for a tournament. But first of all, Shahan, well, that's an excellent account of the game you gave her. But first of all, maybe just to give a background and a little build up to it. Yeah, Wales went into this game a win. They were 1 win away from what would have been a dream for them, which would have been qualifying for a World Cup. Now, they had started this qualifying campaign somewhat poorly in that they had went to Romania and lost 5-1. They had gone to Belgium and lost 2-0. but some improved form throughout, particularly during the second half of the 1992-93 season and in the early months of the 93-94 season, that propelled Wales back into qualification contention. Now, it was really, you see, Romania was sort of, I suppose, they were really, again, a flair team. And again, they were another up-and-coming team at this stage. You know, you had George Hagi, you had Flan Radicioiu, Ili Dumitrescu, Georgi Popescu, and, you know, several other players that were going to make a mark in the years to come. So they were really very much an emerging team. And they were something of sort of a flamboyant team in that the style of soccer they played was not too dissimilar to the way the Brazilians would have played. You know, they were full of flair and creativity and so on. Whereas Wales, on the other hand, were really, you know, they were really, for want of a better term, and with no disrespect to any of the players, you know, they were really a bunch of journeymen in that you had some genuine talents on the team, you know, players like Ryan Giggs, Ian Rush, who was coming to the end of his career at that stage, Dean Saunders, Mark Hughes. But really the rest of the team, they were really sort of, you know, they were performing, shall we say, at middle of the road Premier League clubs, or maybe in a division below that. So, yeah, the Independent newspaper in England actually described them as a hodgepodge of disparate talents. Because of their limitations, they really espoused kind of a British type style of soccer. Not too dissimilar to the way Jack Charlton would have done with the Republic of Ireland. And so this game was fascinating in that it was really kind of, it was a contest between manly endeavour and honest effort against flair and skill and creativity. And Wales actually came so very close to pulling off, you know, what would have been a dream result for them, as in qualifying for USA 94. Apparently, the build-up to this game had been unprecedented because, I mean, it was the first time in a lifetime that Wales were within touch and distance of qualifying for a World Cup. And indeed, even the BBC, who were the British television broadcasting company, the state broadcaster, they were actually broadcasting the England San Marino game. But early in the second half of that England San Marino game, they actually switched to the Welsh match, just as Wales had been awarded that penalty, which was missed. The game started tentatively enough. You know, Wales naturally, the enormity of the occasion and so on would have played in their minds. So Romania were sort of looking dangerous, you know, kind of on some half counter attacks and so on. But as you say, was it Georgi Hagi put Romania ahead midway through the first half? Was a shot from the edge of the penalty area that maybe Neville Southall could have done a bit better with. Because I think there was a feeling at this stage that Neville Southall was sort of past his best, you know, as a goalkeeper. It was something really of maybe a soft goal to concede for a goalkeeper of Neville Southall standards. So that put Romania ahead. So Wales anyway battled back, as you say, and early in the second half then they equalised from a corner. And then a couple of minutes later came that famous or that infamous, you know, penalty and the subsequent miss. But Gary Speed, who was actually fouled for the penalty, by his own admission, he went down rather easily. He was tugged by Dan Petrescu and he went down rather easily. The penalty was given. But Gary actually said afterwards that in hindsight, maybe if he'd stayed on his feet, he could have actually scored himself. And maybe if Wales had gone ahead at that stage, you know, Wales might have seen out the game. Because suddenly the momentum was with Wales at that stage. And the penalty then, Paul Borden, you know, he was a reliable penalty taker. But, I mean, this was an entirely different set of pressurised circumstances where potentially a World Cup qualification place was hinging on a penalty kick. He actually missed the penalty. Wales, anyway, kind of, they continued to battle on, but you kind of sensed at that stage, you know, kind of that maybe their race was run. That maybe their spirit somewhat kind of died at that moment. And then in the concluding stages of that game, Romania scored a second goal. Again, Neville Southall maybe was arguably culpable as well for this second Romanian goal. But Radicioiu anyway got the second goal. And yeah, the game finished 2-1 and Romania went through. But again, having watched the highlights of this game, Shahan, you would have to ask questions really of Neville Southall because, I mean, 10 years earlier, these goals he certainly would not have conceded. So maybe, as I say, he was past his best at that stage because the two goals that beat him were both kind of, long range shots. But anyway, it was heartbreaking for Wales. It was really I suppose it was really the end of the road, for stalwarts like Ian Rush and one or two other players. Mark Hughes, of course, was suspended for this game, so he was unable to take part. But it was really a sad evening for Wales. But I mean, the evening became even darker. And this really put everything into perspective when, as the final whistle was being sounded, a flare was thrown from one side of the ground. It actually went all across the pitch to the other side of the ground, and it hit an elderly spectator, and the spectator lost his life. So that really put the heartbreak on the pitch into perspective. Now, the other game in this group, Belgium and the RCS, there's actually little or no footage of this game as far as I know. And I remember that night in Eurosport, I don't think there was any highlights of the game shown. So we only have kind of newspaper reports of it. But by all accounts, it was a sort of nondescript game. Belgium, actually, it was a 0-0 draw. So Belgium got the point to take them through. And Philippe Albert, who, later played for Newcastle United, he was sent off early in the second half of this game.
Yes.
But by all accounts, anyway, it was a fairly nondescript game, ended 0-0, and that took Belgium through. Now, we should have said, of course, Wales as well, it was also the end of the road for Terry Yorrett, who was their manager, because for some reason, the Welsh FA decided not to renew his contract, even though there was a huge groundswell of support for him to continue. And within a year, Wales, had kind of descended into mediocrity again, because by the time the following fall came around in 1994, they were beaten 5-0 in Georgia in a Euro 96 qualifier, and they also had lost in Moldova. So Wales really had become a rabble again, in a short space
With
of
Willie
time.
Jones, no less.
Yes, Finney Jones, and actually that was actually something of that became something almost of a pantomime, because just before Finney Jones had declared for Wales, he also had expressed an interest in declaring for the Republic of Ireland. Because actually, during USA 94, he was actually filmed in Cork, which is a city in Ireland, wearing an Irish jersey. He intended anyway, he wanted to play for the Republic. And of course, he came one day anyway to Dublin to, search his ancestry. And of course, being Finney, of course, he made a whole publicity show out of it. He was on the front of newspapers and everything, kind of pictured in a library tracing his ancestry. So when Jack Charlton anyway got wind of this, Jack Charlton actually said that, he was going to have nothing to do with him from then on, because Jack Charlton did not want these kind of celebrity players, kind of maybe using the Republic of Ireland as a celebrity or as a kind of a stepping stone to celebrity status. So that really finished Jack Charlton's whatever interest now I don't know whether he would have been interested in selecting Finney Jones or not, but whatever interest he would have.
He said, I think, wasn't it quoted as saying, like, we need Vinnie Jones, like we need a hole in our head or something like that.
Yeah. But I think it was kind of Finney Jones's antics, kind of in Max, getting his own personal publicity out of tracing his roots, that kind of, turned Jack Charlton off him.
Okay. Let's discuss Group 5. Group 5, which turned out to be the most unexciting group of all. We have, Yugoslavia was supposed to be in this group, and you mentioned they were disqualified from the World Cup participation. So the teams that were left were Greece, Russia, Iceland, Hungary, and Luxembourg. So Hungary had been stagnating since 1986 World Cup, and at this point, they were no longer the team that they once were. So it was assumed to be that this would be a group that would be won by Russia. However, surprisingly, Greece turned out to be the group winner. In fact, going into the last day, the only issue was who was going to win this group, Greece or Russia, as they were both level on points. And in the end, at Athens, Greece won this match 1-0. And again, there was nothing at stake. They were both already qualified, but Greece won the group outright in this match. So that was the only takeaway. But again, Greece would perform disastrously at the World Cup, And the what ifs were really about what would have happened had Yugoslavia been present,
Indeed.
and chances were Greece would not be qualifying for the World Cup had Yugoslavia
Yeah,
been present. So,
indeed.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's it. And then, of course, the other question is, how would that Yugoslavian team have done at the World Cup? It would have been really interesting as well,
right,
you know.
right.
Or maybe as well, Shahan, kind of, I think Croatia had, set up themselves at this stage, but I think they were just marginally late in getting themselves ratified. This 94 World Cup campaign came just too soon for Croatia. I think indeed, if the World Cup qualification had started a month or two later, Croatia may have been ratified at that stage to take part in the group, but it wasn't to be anyways. It was the Russians and Greece, I should
Greece.
say, went through. And then of course, when USA 94 came around, I think there was some defections from the Russian
Oh
team, wasn't
yes,
there?
yes. That
And
was the other story. Yeah, a lot of their stars, including Igor Shalimov and Andrei Kanchelskis, there was a number of them. They had issues with their manager, Pavel Sadirin, and they boycotted the national team. So the team
mm,
that went to the World Cup was actually closer to a B team than the main
yes,
Russian team. And
yes.
yeah,
That's right, yeah. This was really kind of, I suppose, the one group that was done and dusted. So there was really nothing to kind of say much about this group other than that Greece and Russia were the two qualifiers. But
yes,
again, if Yugoslavia or maybe a team like Croatia had been in this group, the qualification could have been so very different.
certainly
Mm.
more exciting than what we got.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So now we come to the final group in the European zone, Group 6, with France, Sweden, Bulgaria, Austria, Finland, and Israel. So by this point, Sweden had already qualified. It was a fight between France and Bulgaria. And let's remember, in their previous match in October, France only needed 1 point in a match against Israel, but they lost at home.
They lost two late goals,
Yes.
actually.
So Bulgaria now had an outside chance to qualify. The final match in this group was between France and Bulgaria at Paris. France needed only a tie. Bulgaria had to win to advance. Well, we know what happens. France takes the lead through Eric Cantona in the 31st minute. Few minutes later, Emil Kostadinov ties the match in the 36th minute. So France held on until the last minute, and you could tell us what happens.
Yes, indeed. An incident that sparked a feud between a player and a manager that nearly 20 years later culminated in a lawsuit. So, anyway, for anyone that doesn't know, we were in the final seconds. There was about 20 seconds left of normal time of this France Bulgaria game. And David Ginola had the ball almost by the Bulgarian corner flag. So, all he had to do was just hold on to it and play it safe, play out the clock. Because in those days, Jahan, there was little injury time played at the end of matches. It's not like today, kind of where you could have 7 or 8 minutes as the norm for injury time. In those days, even 3 minutes of injury time was regarded as a lot of injury time. So once time was up, there was going to be very little injury time played subsequently. So anyway, David Ginola anyway had the ball and he had it by the corner flag. So I mean, I suppose maybe the logical thing to do would have been just to, play down the clock. But for some reason, and I suppose only David Ginola will know this himself, he attempted, a long crossfield pass towards Eric Cantona, who was on the other side. The pass went astray. It was intercepted by Bulgaria. And 16 seconds later, the ball was in the French net at the other end, thanks to a swift counter-attack. Luboslav Penev actually got the ball and he flicked the ball onto Emil Kostadinov, who scored, what was a good goal. It was an awesome finish. I mean, it was a real howitzer of a shot from an extremely tight angle and, hit it while running at pace. So it was a good goal. I mean, take nothing away from it. But I mean, the way in which France had qualification and it all went up in smoke in a matter of seconds. And the irony was that really, Emil Kostadinov and Luboslav Penev both should not have been playing for Bulgaria that night. In that, the Bulgarian FA had for some reason forgotten to apply for travel visas for both these players prior to this game. But Borislav Mikhailov, the Bulgarian goalkeeper, and there was another Bulgarian player as well whose name escapes me. They were both playing in France at the time for a club called Mulhouse, which was sort of on the border with Bulgaria or close enough to the border. So Luboslav Pinev anyway and Kostadinov, the guys who did not have travel visas, they sneaked in to Mihailov's house, which was more or less kind of close to a border post where security wasn't that tight. So they sneaked in the night before, spent the night in Mihailov's house before heading to Paris. Yeah. So actually, Rob Smythe in The Guardian actually described them as illegal aliens. which in one way was a good description. But anyway, from a French point of view, I mean, it was the equivalent of, I suppose, 9/11. Really, I mean, it was really something of an Armageddon moment in that they were concluding their qualifying campaign with 2 home matches against both Israel and Bulgaria, who would have been seen as being inferior to France, and yet
And
they
needing
contrived
only
to lose
1 point, and needing only 1 point in these 2
yes,
matches. Yeah.
and contrived to lose both these games to late goals, and through stopping. So, needless to say, I mean, Gerard Houllier, who was manager of France at the time, it cost him his job. David Ginola, did he ever play for France again after this?
He did, yes. He did
Or did
into
he? Oh, yeah,
late
yeah.
95. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, did he? Oh,
Yeah.
okay, yes, okay. And as it turned out as well, even though we didn't know it at the time, this was also one of the last games that Eric Cantona would have played for France.
Yes. Yes.
Because when he was suspended the following season, he was subsequently never selected for France again after that.
Right. In Ginola's defense, he did not lose the ball in front of goal. He lost the ball on the other end of the field.
Oh, yes,
So there's like
that's
a
right.
whole 10 other players in between that could have,
Yeah, yeah.
So
And of course, and you see, David Ginola would have been a flair player. So I mean, he kind of, playing down the clock would not have entered his subconsciousness.
right.
Kind of he would have concentrated on playing the ball. So as I say, he attempted anyway a long crossfield pass towards Eric Cantona, which unfortunately went astray, and Bulgaria got their goal from that. But anyway, Gerard Houllier, needless to say, was absolutely furious because not only had it cost him his job, kind of, I suppose it left, an indelible stain on his managerial career, which he would have regarded as, I suppose, maybe, an unnecessary stain. He said after the game anyway, he said that David Ginola committed a crime against the team and that he sent an Exocet missile through the heart of French football. So the feud anyway between David Ginola and Gerard Houllier continued. And I believe back around 2011, Gerard Houllier wrote a book, or he was part of a book called Manager Secrets. And in that book, he referred to that game in 1993, and he called David Ginola a salaud, Salaud, which is French for, excuse the word, bastard.
Yes.
So David Ginola's response was to issue legal proceedings. Now, I don't think the legal proceedings came to anything subsequently, but I mean, it was, kind of a real shock to the system for France because, I mean, they had also missed out on qualifying for Italia 90. They were going to host, the next World Cup in 1998. So they were very much seen as a potential dark horse for the World Cup in 94 itself had they qualified. They had a team full of talent, even though they had disappointed a little bit in Euro 92. I mean, their qualification campaigns for both Euro 92 and World Cup 94 were almost flawless up to this point. The suspicion was always there, had France qualified for the World Cup, how well would they have done? But it wasn't to be anyway. Bulgaria actually, even though Bulgaria were kind of blown hot and cold in this qualification campaign, they had beaten France in Sofia back in 1992, early in the qualifying campaign. So, I mean, Bulgaria could say that, they beat France home and away, as it turned out. So maybe They could say with some justification that they deserve to be there. And as it turned out, they turned out to be one of the success stories of USA 94, as indeed did the Swedes. We can all indulge in wishful thinking, but going back to what I said a few moments ago there, had Yugoslavia taken part in the qualifying and, if they had qualified, I mean, potentially in USA 94, you would have had a group where you would have had in Group D, Argentina, Nigeria, France would have been there instead of Bulgaria if France had qualified, and Yugoslavia would have been there instead of Greece. So, I mean, picture a group of Argentina, Nigeria, France, and Yugoslavia. That would have been a humdinger of a group.
Indeed, yeah.
In an overall recap, the 17th November 1993, it was the final night of the old World Cup qualifying system. And, in some ways, it's a shame that there hasn't been a night like it since. I mean, it was a night loaded with drama. As I say, because multi-channel TV was in its infancy, a lot of people around Europe, apart from the match that their own team were playing, they had no idea as to how the other games were going. So it only emerged maybe, a couple of hours later what had transpired in the other games. And it had long-term consequences as well in that maybe France maybe not qualifying for that World Cup. Amy Jackie came in as manager and he built a team that, ultimately won the World Cup in 1998.
Yes.
And of course, England as well, Graham Taylor lost his job. He was replaced by Terry Venables, and England went so close in Euro 96.
Let's also mention that, okay, this was the end of the qualifiers in Europe, but there was one last match, the playoff between Argentina and Australia.
That's right.
And
yes, indeed.
And let's remind everyone that Argentina had lost to Colombia at home 5-0. As a result, Diego Maradona had come out of retirement back to the national team to help qualify. In this match in Buenos Aires, Argentina won on an own goal. They were through to the World Cup too.
Yes, yes. But I think as it turned out, they would have gone through in the away goals rule anyway, even if that game had finished 0-0.
Yes, because the first leg was 1-1. You're right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because I remember that match actually. You see, it was actually broadcast live on DSF, which was a German television station, which was actually available in Ireland through the Astra satellite. But the match kicked off at midnight our time, and I was in my final year in school, so I had to be up early the next day. So I did not stay up for it, but I had an inkling anyway that Argentina were going to prevail, and so they did. And I think actually as well, did Carlos McAllister play in that match for Argentina? He would be Alexis McAllister's
Yes,
dad.
indeed. Yeah. Carlos
Yeah.
McAllister did play in that match.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was quite an eventful night. And the 30th anniversary of it was last November. And maybe in some ways it went almost unnoticed, apart from, the football anoraks like me and you and, some others, But yeah, I mean, it was a momentous and historic night as it turned out in World Cup qualification history. And, in many ways, it would be lovely, kind of in the future, if there was a night like it again. I know nowadays we have nights like that, in playoff nights and so on. But,
Right.
for a night there was no playoffs and there was so much at stake. And I mean, there was 8 qualifying places up for grabs that night alone. And as I said, it was only when the final whistle sounded in the final match to finish did we know for sure who was qualifying and who was out.
So you think at the time, more than 30 years ago, was it self-evident that we had witnessed one of the most dramatic nights in football? Or do you think the impact has really been addressed in the last few years? Like I said, maybe not by everybody, but by football historians, you think?
I would go for the latter, Shahan. In that, you see, at that time, I mean, naturally enough, we all thought that the qualifying system in Europe at the time would continue. But by the time the next one came around, UEFA decided to change it because groups had got bigger, you see, and there was more teams to fit in. So it was not possible to have 16 groups, with the top 2 qualifying, because you would have had groups of 7 and 8 teams. And, how would you fit in, all the qualifying matches? So because of the influx of teams for the next qualification, particularly from Eastern Europe and, the former Yugoslavia, and of course, Czechoslovakia, dividing in 2, it became more, kind of, I suppose, prudent to have maybe 7 or 8 or 9 qualifying groups where the winners would qualify, and there would not be enough automatic places for the runners-up. So the runners-up would go into a series of playoffs that would decide, the remaining qualifiers.
The ramifications and the immediate consequences, you mentioned some of the managers who lost their posts. Gérard Houllier for France, Graham Taylor, replaced soon by Terry Venables for England. Obviously, Andy Roxburgh of Scotland had lost his post just a few months earlier after almost 7 years in charge.
Scotland were a surprise in that, kind of, they never really looked like qualifying. They never really got going from the outset, really. And now maybe they were going through a bit of transition at the time as well. But because they had qualified for Euro 92, but they came back and qualified for Euro 96 and the 98 World Cup. So whether it was that Scotland were just going through a transitionary season or two, or that they just, for whatever reason, bottomed out in this group, I don't know.
In a way, for let's say for France, this was kind of the end of the Papin Cantona generation with Aimé Jacquet in charge. It would be the beginning of the Zidane generation. With Wales, Terry Yorath was sacked, which was a harsh decision.
And I think why they sacked him was he wanted, I think, slightly more money or something.
With Bulgaria qualifying, chances are Hristo Stoichkov would not have won the Ballon d'Or in 1994
No,
had Bulgaria not qualified. So
no.
that was also sliding doors moment.
And as it turned out, he was a fantastic footballer.
Right,
He was down with Barcelona at the time.
right.
But if it hadn't been for that, maybe he played in 98 as well in the World Cup, but maybe he was a little past his best by then. But by 94 anyway, we were seeing him at his peak on the highest stage.
Right. And for the first time since pre-war, basically
Yes.
there was not a single British team in the World Cup.
Yeah, yeah. Although the Republic of Ireland were kind of, a lot of people in Britain would have cheered them on anyway at the World Cup because,
Right,
all the Republic's players would have been from England or Scotland. So they would have been almost like, a second British team, as it were.
right.
If you want to use that terminology.
Given the landscape of how the qualification is processed these days, nights like these are virtually impossible because I don't think playoffs really carry the drama of
No,
this night with every so
no,
many results minute by minute. Some team
yeah,
could have qualified at the expense of the other. So there was
yeah,
much more
yeah.
drama in a situation like this.
That's right. And also as well, you see, in most of the groups, you had 3 teams going for 2 places. And, 2 of the 3 contenders were actually meeting each other on that night as well.
Right, right. And yeah,
So something was going
any
to give.
and
Yeah.
any of the teams that were eliminated would have been worthy qualifiers. There was not that
Oh,
much difference between
absolutely.
the teams.
Last year, actually, a thought came into my head, and again, it's a sliding doors moment. Kind of that USA '94. You could have almost dreamed up an alternative USA '94 where teams like France and maybe even England and perhaps even Wales and that would have been there instead of some of the other teams that qualified in their place, and trying in your own mind then, to predict results and how these teams would have fared. But I have to say as well, Shahan, just before we move away from all of this, now, I know we're kind of jumping slightly ahead here to USA '94, but you mentioned at the top of the program that Franz Beckenbauer said that some teams will find qualifying one thing, but then when they get to a tournament, they find it another. And I was mentioning about Switzerland and Norway as well. In that, these were teams, as I say, that, kind of, I was expecting more from at USA '94, and for some reason, it just didn't do
Right,
it.
right.
And I suppose as well, Shahan, the biggest one, I suppose, the biggest team you could put into this category actually would have been Colombia.
Oh yeah,
Because
well,
everybody,
there
and
were many off-field reasons because of that.
what mystified me as well always was that a lot of people seemed to be talking up Colombia just on the basis of this 5-0 game against
Right.
Argentina. Now, this game would not have been televised in Britain or Europe. So I don't know how many people actually saw this game to begin with. Were people just maybe going on maybe the result without actually seeing the game and then saying to themselves, this Colombia team must be good?
No, well, this Colombia, you have to realize there was more to it than the result. It was the style they were playing. It was called the Tok, which was like a tiki-taka version
Mm.
equivalent of the day. So there had been improvements in the team's play, and you had Faustino Aspria, who was at Parma in Italy, and he was the sensation of Serie A. So there were
Mm.
reasons for this prediction. In closing, what do you think is the legacy of this day, November 17, 1993, in the history of football for so many nations?
Yeah. Well, it has left a legacy in that, as I said, it made heroes of a number of players, made heroes of a number of managers, made villains of others. And I think it showed as well that you can have excitement and drama and suspense without the need for playoffs. Because, the thinking nowadays seems to be that if you want drama or excitement, you have to have a playoff. But
Yeah.
not so, and not always the case. And this night, 17th November 1993, as I say, it was the final night of the old World Cup. So really, the old qualifying system finished that night as well, even though we didn't know it at the time. So because of that, and because of the fact that there was so much excitement and so much riding on almost all the games that were played in Europe that night, that it will always remain, it will always be etched in stone, and it should always remain in the collective soccer memory, I think.
Yeah.
Just for anybody that's listening to this or tuning in, I should point out as well that a journalist in England who writes for the Guardian newspaper, Rob Smythe, Smyth. Well, we will pronounce it Smith here, but he pronounced it Smythe. If you go into Google or a search engine and search Rob Smythe, Smyth, 17th November 1993, he wrote a fantastic article a number of years ago for the Guardian newspaper, and I would thoroughly recommend it as essential reading, for anyone who would be interested in the events of this night.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Once again, I would like to thank you for this interview. It was a pleasant discussion, brought back a lot of memories. And I want to thank you in the first place for actually triggering my interest for this topic. Thank you again. And I would urge everyone to also please read the main blog article as well for more detail. The link is included on the video upload description, along with our respective contact
So, so,
information.
sorry, Shahan, just one very final point, and I know you just thought of it there when you were speaking. A lot of the matches that we discussed, they subsequently have been made available in their entirety on YouTube. So if anyone wants, to look back at the matches, they can do so now at this stage.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
So thanks again, and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Yes, indeed. And looking forward to the next one already, Shahan. And thank you ever so much as always.
Thank you.